My name doesn't matter much for this story, but what does matter is that I've been putting miles on trucks for going on 22 years, and in that time, I've driven through 41 states, slept in maybe 300 different truck stops, and had exactly 2 experiences I still can't explain to anyone's satisfaction, including my own. And this is the first one. It happened on US Highway 50 in Nevada, which people call the loneliest road in America, and they're not being dramatic about it. That road earns the name every single time you're on it after dark, because there is nothing out there, not a light, not a building, not a sound except your own engine, and whatever the wind is doing to the sagebrush, and the mountains sitting dark against the sky so far away they look like something painted on a wall rather than real geography. I was running a load of auto parts west from Denver, pushing through the night because my delivery window was tight, and I'd already burned 30 minutes at a scale house outside Ely. And around 1 in the morning, my GPS unit, the company-issued Garmin that I kept updated and had never had a serious problem with, decided to tell me there was a closure ahead and that I needed to take an alternate route. Now I've driven Highway 50 enough times to know that alternate routes on that stretch are basically a joke, because there's the highway and there's the desert, and that's the whole geography of the situation. So I kept driving and waited for the unit to figure out it had made a mistake. It didn't. It kept recalculating, kept insisting on a turn that was coming up in about 3 miles, and when I got close enough to see with my headlights where it was pointing, there was actually a road there, a 2-lane paved road cutting off to the south into total darkness, with no sign, no mile marker, no name, just pavement that had no business being in a place where every map I'd ever seen showed nothing but dry lake bed stretching for 30 miles. I sat with my foot on the brake for a second and told myself this was a glitch. The GPS had confused some old mining track with a real route, and I should ignore it and stay on 50. I know I should have done exactly that. Instead, I turned, and I'll be honest about why. Because I was tired enough that the part of my brain that makes good decisions had already clocked out for the night, and there was something about that road that looked too clean, too new, too much like it had been put there deliberately, rather than left over from some mining operation half a century ago. I drove maybe 4 miles on it, and the road was smooth the whole way. No potholes, no gravel creep onto the pavement, no weeds coming up through cracks the way abandoned roads always get. It looked like it had been paved the previous week, which made no sense given that there was absolutely nothing at the end of it that would justify the expense of paving it. Then the radio, which I'd had on a country station out of Ely, went completely silent, and I mean truly silent, not static, not a hiss, just nothing, like the frequency had ceased to exist, and at the same moment my GPS stopped showing any location data. The blue arrow that represents my truck just sat on the screen with no road beneath it, no town names, no route numbers, just a blue arrow floating in a grey nothing. I did a slow 3-point turn, which took a while given the width of my rig, and when I got turned around and started back the way I'd come, the radio kicked on again in the middle of a song, exactly where it had cut off, like no time had passed at all. I pulled back onto Highway 50, and when I looked in my mirror, the road I'd just been on was not there. And I don't mean it was hidden by darkness or distance. I mean the shoulder where the turnoff should have been was flat scrubland going unbroken in both directions as far as my running lights reached. My GPS beeped once and said rerouting to US Highway 50, like it was confirming something, and I drove the rest of that night with both hands tight on the wheel and the radio louder than I usually keep it, not because music helped, but because silence felt worse. I've looked at satellite images of that stretch of 50 more times than I'd like to admit, from every angle available, and there is no road there. There has never been a road there, and I have no explanation for what I drove on for 4 miles in the middle of a Nevada night, or what would have been at the end of it if I'd kept going instead of turning around. The second time something got under my skin out here, I was running I-84 through Idaho, and this was winter, late October, cold enough that the fields on both sides of the highway had gone silver with frost, and the sky had that flat black quality it gets when there's no moisture in it. Nothing to scatter the stars, just dark with pinpricks of light so sharp they looked like they were right above the cab. I know this stretch well, because I've driven it probably 200 times. It runs flat and straight through the high desert between Twin Falls and Mountain Home, and at 3 in the morning there is genuinely nothing on it. Sometimes not another vehicle for 40 minutes in either direction, which is actually something I used to like about it because it gave me time to think. Around mile marker 194, I saw someone standing on the shoulder, and my first instinct was the practical one. You see someone on the side of a road in the middle of the night in freezing temperatures, and your first thought is that something's wrong and they need help, not anything else. So I began to slow down even before I fully processed what I was looking at. She was standing with her back straight and her arms at her sides, which people in distress don't usually do. They wave, they step toward the road, they do something to get your attention, and she was doing none of that, just standing there like she was waiting for a bus. She'd already waited for a long time. She had a long coat on, belted, old-fashioned, the kind you see in photographs from the 40s, and her hair was loose past her shoulders, and even at 70 miles an hour, the wind was hard enough that my antenna was quivering, but her hair wasn't moving at all. I got close enough that my headlights should have lit her up the way they light up any roadside object, sharp and bright and casting a shadow behind it, but the light didn't seem to reach her the same way. She stayed the same flat grey she'd been at a distance, like my lights were going around her, and when I was maybe 200 feet away, she turned her head and looked directly at my truck. And I felt it before I understood it. This sensation in my chest, like someone had pressed 2 cold hands against my ribs from the inside. I didn't stop. I want to be clear about that. I pressed the accelerator, and I passed mile marker 194 at close to 80, and I did not look in my mirrors for the next 5 miles. What makes it hard to leave behind is what happened 6 months later, when I mentioned it to another driver at a Flying J outside Nampa, somebody I'd driven with years before, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, and then he asked me if she was wearing a coat with a belt and if her hair was down, and when I said yes, his face went a particular way that faces go when something frightens a person who doesn't scare easily. He'd seen her 4 years before I did. Same stretch, same shoulder, same stillness. I've talked to drivers on that route since, carefully, the way you ask these things when you don't want to sound like you've lost your grip, and I've found 5 others who've seen her, never during the day, always that same flat grey in the headlights, always the same stillness, and not one of them found a record of an accident at that spot, not in the county records, not in the newspaper archives, not anywhere that should have an answer if there was one to find. Last winter, she'd moved to the white line, 1 step off the shoulder, and I don't know what it means that she's getting closer to the road, but I've decided I don't need to find out firsthand. There's a story a woman named Denise told me in a truck wash outside Reno, and she's been driving 9 years, reefer freight mostly, California and Nevada routes, And she's not the kind of person who tells stories to get a reaction. She tells them the same way she does everything else, which is precisely and without much decoration. And that's exactly why this one stuck with me. She was crossing Highway 50 solo one night, her regular route, and around 2 in the morning, she started picking up a voice on her CB that she didn't recognize, not a handle she knew, not a voice she could place. And the strange thing wasn't that someone was talking on the channel. Strange things talk on channels at 2 in the morning all the time. The strange thing was that the voice said her name, her actual first name, Denise, which she had never once given out over the radio in 9 years of driving. Because you don't do that. For 100 practical reasons, you don't broadcast your name on an open channel, and this voice knew it. She keyed the mic and asked who was there, and the voice said, calm as anything, that she was going the wrong way, and then it went quiet and didn't come back no matter how many times she keyed up. She checked her GPS, her paper atlas, her own mental map of a route she'd driven dozens of times, and everything told her she was exactly where she should be, so she kept going, because what else do you do on a 2-lane highway at 2 in the morning when you can't stop and you're not actually lost? About 90 seconds after the voice, her GPS did something she'd never seen it do before. Her position marker jumped 40 miles south and showed her on a county road that doesn't connect to Highway 50 at any point, just sitting out there in the middle of nowhere. And then it snapped back like a rubber band and showed her exactly where she was. Like a brief hallucination the machine had experienced and then recovered from. She kept her route, she kept her exit, she didn't deviate, and about 2 miles past where the GPS had tried to put her, there was a wreck, a semi and a pickup truck, the kind of wreck where the ambulance is already there, but moving slowly because the urgency is already gone, and the traffic backup from it stretched back far enough that if she'd been 10 minutes later, she'd have sat in it for an hour or more. She's told that story exactly 3 times, to people she trusts, and every time the reaction she gets is the same, which is that it was coincidence and a glitchy GPS, and she was tired and heard her name on the CB, because your brain fills in familiar things when you're running solo at 2 in the morning. Maybe that's true, Denise says, and then she usually gets quiet for a moment, and then she says that whatever it was, she's been grateful for it ever since. I want to tell you about a rest area outside Salina, Kansas, on I-70, because rest areas at 3 in the morning are their own kind of strange even on the best nights, and this was not the best night. I'm Marcus. I've been driving 6 years, dry van and flatbed, and this happened during my 2nd year when I was still learning which instincts to trust and which ones to argue with. I'd pulled in because I'd hit my hours, and the law is the law, whether you feel tired or not. And it was one of those older rest areas, brick building, fluorescent lights humming in the bathroom that you could hear from the parking lot, picnic tables nobody uses at that hour, the whole place lit up just enough to be almost but not quite reassuring. There was one other truck in the lot when I pulled in, an old conventional with a long hood, no company name on the door, plain white paint with rust working up around the wheel wells, the kind of truck that belongs to somebody who bought it used 15 years ago and has been running it into the ground ever since, which is not unusual. Plenty of owner-operators run trucks like that. I didn't think anything of it. I climbed into my bunk, and I was asleep fast the way you get when you've been driving since 4 in the morning, and somewhere around 3, I woke up to knocking on my cab door. Not hard, not frantic, just 2 careful knocks the way you'd do if you were trying to be polite about waking someone up. The man standing there when I looked out was older, maybe 65, wearing coveralls with company patches on the shoulders, the kind trucking companies stopped issuing sometime in the late 80s, and he asked very calmly if I had jumper cables, said his battery had gone dead, and he had a tight schedule. I said sure, because that's the kind of thing you do for another driver. Grabbed my cables, climbed down, walked with him to his truck. When we got up close, I put my hand on the hood, which is something you do without thinking, just checking whether it's warm, whether the engine has been running recently, and the hood was cold, engine cold, the kind of cold you get after several hours of sitting in 40-degree air, which didn't square with a dead battery from sitting 20 minutes. I connected the cables anyway, and the engine turned over on the second try, and the man thanked me quietly and said one thing before he climbed back up into his cab. He said, "Tell them I made my delivery. They'll want to know I made it." I didn't know what to say to that. It was the kind of thing somebody says when they're exhausted and talking to themselves as much as to you. So I just nodded and walked back to my truck. I fell asleep again and woke up to my alarm at 6, and when I stepped outside to do my pre-trip, his truck was gone, which was fine. He'd had somewhere to be. What wasn't fine was that it had rained lightly around 4 in the morning, according to what I heard on the radio, and there were no tire tracks in the gravel where his truck had been parked, none at all, even though my own truck had left clear impressions going in and coming out. I asked at the counter of a truck stop in Salina an hour later if they knew anything about that rest area, just making conversation, and the woman working the counter went quiet for a moment and told me drivers had been talking about a man in old coveralls at that rest area for years, and that there'd been a bad accident on that stretch in the late 50s, a driver who'd broken down waiting for help that came too late, and that he'd had a delivery to make and never stopped talking about it right up until the end. I still stop at that rest area when my logbook makes me, and I always check the gravel when I get up in the morning. My name's Wade, and I've been hauling tankers for 15 years, propane and fuel mostly, and I want to tell you about a motel on I-70 in Kansas that I checked into one night and was back on the road by morning with a key in my pocket that has no business existing in the condition it's in. It was late, I was running behind, I'd pushed my hours too far, and my body was telling me clearly that I needed 4 hours flat or something bad was going to happen, and right when that message got through, there was a sign for a motel at exit 219, a place called Sundowner Motor Lodge, with orange neon glowing against the dark, and the exit was right there, so I took it. The lot was gravel, maybe 8 rooms in a low ranch-style row. One other vehicle parked there, an old pickup with so much dust on it you couldn't tell the color, and the office at the end had its light on. The man at the desk was maybe 60, wearing a cardigan and wire-rimmed glasses, and he wrote my name in a paper ledger with a pen on a string, which I hadn't seen in a long time, and gave me an actual metal key with a diamond-shaped tag that said Room 6, and charged me $18, which even then was not a real price for a motel room. I didn't think much about any of that because I was too tired to think much about anything. The room was clean, cool, smelled like old wood and something floral, had a television that received 2 channels badly, and a bed with a chenille spread that I hadn't seen since my grandmother's house, and I slept harder and faster than I had in weeks, which I know now should have told me something, because road sleep is never that clean. I got up at 5, showered, went to check out, and the office was empty, and not empty the way an office is empty when the person who runs it has stepped out back for a minute, empty the way a room is empty when no one has been in it for a long time. The ledger on the counter had dust on it, a quarter-inch at least, and there was no pen on a string. The sign outside, the orange neon I'd followed in from the highway, had half its tubes dead and hanging, and the remaining letters didn't spell anything that made sense. I walked back to my truck, and I drove to my room 6, and the door was standing open, and inside was nothing, just the bones of a room someone had gutted, water damage on the ceiling, floorboards going soft at the edges, a smell of mildew and rot that a single night of sleep inside it would have made impossible to miss. I've kept the key because it's the only proof I have that any of it happened, and a coin dealer I showed it to told me it's a real piece of metalwork from the 1950s, worn down in exactly the pattern of something that's been carried in a pocket and rubbed by a thumb for decades. I've driven that stretch of I-70 probably 50 times since, and there is no sign for the Sundowner, and there is no motel at exit 219, and there hasn't been, according to a county record search I did one afternoon when I was sitting at a terminal with nothing better to do since 1987, when the owner died and the building was condemned and eventually dozed. I don't stop at little roadside places anymore. If the chain's full, I sleep in the cab with the curtain drawn. The one that took me the longest to tell anybody happened on a county road in West Virginia, and I'm Franklin, 30 years driving, retired now, but not from the stories, which seem to have no interest in retiring along with me. This was the late 90s, before GPS meant anything, before cell coverage was reliable past a certain distance from actual towns, and I was hauling livestock through the Appalachians on a route that took me down what locals call Dutch Hollow Road, though the signs just showed a county route number, and the road wasn't wide enough that 2 trucks could comfortably pass each other, which is the kind of detail you remember when you're the one driving the truck. It was raining hard and had been for an hour, visibility down to maybe 100 feet, and my radiator had started running warm in a way that was getting less easy to ignore, and I was starting to do the math on how far I could push it before it became a real problem. That's when I saw the farmhouse set back off the road, maybe 300 feet down a gravel drive, every window lit up yellow from inside, porch light on, chimney smoke going sideways in the wind, the whole picture of a place that was warm and inhabited and might have a phone I could use. I pulled up the drive and knocked on the door, and an older woman answered. Kind face, sensible clothes, the kind of person who invites a stranger in without much hesitation, because the alternative is leaving them standing in the rain, and she told me her husband was out in the barn, but I was welcome to use the kitchen phone. I made my call, got my dispatch, waited for the rain to ease a little, and while I was standing by the kitchen, I noticed a calendar on the wall that was off by about 10 years, which I put down to the kind of oversight that happens in a house where nobody looks at the date much. There was a cold in that kitchen that the fire going in the next room didn't seem to be touching, and I didn't know what to make of that except to stay close to the doorway and not think about it too hard. I thanked her, went back to my truck, and the radiator temperature had come down to normal without me having touched anything under the hood, which I didn't understand but was grateful for. I looked back once as I pulled out of the drive, and every window in that house went dark all at once, like a single switch somewhere had been thrown, even though I'd have sworn I looked away for no more than 3 seconds. I ran that route for another 11 years, every few months, and I looked for that farmhouse every single time I came through that stretch, slowing to a crawl at every gravel drive and turn-off, and I never found it again. Not once, not even the shape of a cleared area where a house might have sat. About 10 years ago, I mentioned it to an older driver who knew that part of the state, and he told me without much surprise that there'd been a farmhouse on that road that burned sometime in the 50s. Chimney fire took the whole family, and that drivers on that route had been talking about lights in the windows of a house that wasn't there for as long as anyone could remember. I've had 30 years to think about that kitchen and that cold that the fire wouldn't touch, and the most honest thing I can tell you is that I still don't know whether I was glad to be there or glad to have left. The story I haven't told many people happened on US 2 in Montana in January, during a whiteout that was bad enough that I was doing 35 and still couldn't fully trust what was on either side of me, and his name, the name he gave me, was Delbert. I'm going to tell this the way it happened, which means telling you first that I don't pick up hitchhikers. I never have. The company says no, and common sense says no, and experience says no. But what I saw standing on the shoulder of US 2 that night was not what I would have called a hitchhiker in any ordinary sense of the word. He was an old man, maybe 70, standing in wind chill that was doing something in the negative 30s according to the radio, and he had no coat on, just a button-down shirt and trousers and work boots, which meant either he'd been there long enough that the cold had stopped registering, or he'd just stepped out of a vehicle that had stopped very recently. I pulled over. He got in slowly, like joints that had gone stiff, and thanked me in a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere much further back than 70 years, and when I asked what had happened, he said his truck had broken down a ways back. I never saw a broken-down truck, in either direction, for the rest of that drive. We went quiet for a while, and then he asked what year it was. Not the date, the year. And when I told him, he nodded like he was adding a column of numbers in his head, and didn't much like the sum. He had his hands in his coat pocket, and at one point he pulled them out to look at something he was holding, and I saw a fistful of old coins, heavy ones, not anything modern, and he picked one out and set it on my dash and said it was for the ride. And when I said he didn't owe me anything, he said I always pay my way, in a tone that made it sound like a point of pride that had been non-negotiable his entire life. I dropped him at a truck stop outside Havre, and he walked toward the building, and I looked down at my logbook for the 10 seconds it took to write the time, and when I looked back across the lot, he wasn't there. Not walking away from the building, not going inside, not anywhere in that lit-up lot, and the snow that had been coming down was already filling in the tracks he should have left, and there weren't many of them to fill in. I've kept the coin because I took it to a man who does estate sales and appraisals, and he got very quiet looking at it under his lamp and told me it was a genuine 1893 Morgan silver dollar, which in itself is not remarkable, except that its wear pattern was wrong for a coin that had been sitting in a collection. It had been handled for a very long time by someone who carried it as a habit, and its condition otherwise was better than it had any right to be given that wear, like it had been preserved by something other than luck. I looked up the name Delbert in connection with US Highway 2 and Havre and an accident or breakdown, more out of stubbornness than expectation, and I found an obituary from a Havre paper dated 1962, a freight driver named Delbert Aldous Kinney, who had died of exposure after his rig broke an axle in a whiteout 12 miles east of town. No next of kin listed. I've driven US 2 in winter a dozen times since, and every time the snow is heavy, I think about an old man standing in it with no coat, and I keep my foot on the brake a little longer than I used to whenever I see something on the shoulder that might be a person. The last one I'm going to tell you I've sat with for a long time before deciding to say it out loud, because it doesn't end the way stories are supposed to end. It doesn't give you anything to hold on to. It just sits there like something that happened and then didn't stop happening. And I'll say my name is Curtis, 20 years of driving, former military before that. And the thing I need you to understand before I start is that I don't use that background as a badge. I use it as context, because when I tell you something put a chill in me that took a week to shake, I want you to understand what standard I'm measuring that against. This happened in the Ozarks, a secondary highway through the hills, timber on both sides so dense that on a clear night you still can't see a sky worth looking at, just the tunnel of your headlights and the road doing what Ozark roads do, which is find new ways to turn without warning. I'd been rerouted off the main route by a bridge closure and ended up on a 2-lane that my app said was fine, but that I knew immediately had less traffic than was normal even for that country, because the road felt undriven, if that makes sense to you, like the surface had been sitting undisturbed long enough that it had started to forget it was a road. Around midnight, I passed a diner, lit up warm, every window yellow, a sign out front in red neon, 3 trucks parked in the lot, the whole thing as solid and real as anything I'd seen all night. And I didn't stop because I was behind schedule, but I noted it the way you note landmarks on an unfamiliar route. Told myself I'd swing in on the way back if I was still on that road. 2 days later I was, same detour, same bridge still out, and I was hungry and running ahead of schedule, and I remembered the diner and started watching for it, and it wasn't there. I drove the whole stretch twice at low speed, and there was no diner, no sign, no trucks, not even a gravel lot where one might have sat, just timber and underbrush going unbroken on both sides. I stopped at a gas station near the county line and described what I'd seen, the location as best I could give it, and the man behind the counter, who was the kind of age where he'd seen most things that had happened in that county, told me there had been a diner right about where I was describing, run by a family for 3 generations, and that it had burned down in a fire sometime back in the 70s, and that the lot had been cleared and left alone since, because the family that owned it didn't want to build again and didn't want to sell, and that people who drove that road late sometimes said they could still see the lights on, but only the first time, only the once, like it showed itself to strangers passing through, and then decided it had already been seen enough. I've driven that road maybe 8 times since on various reroutes, and the diner has never been there again, and I've made my peace with the idea that I was one of the ones it let see it, and that there's no particular reason it chose me, and that the most I can say for it is that for a moment on a dark and empty road, it looked like somewhere warm to stop, and I think that's probably what it always was, and maybe still is, for the people it decides to show itself to. There's a stretch of I-10 through West Texas where the highway runs so flat and so straight that after about 40 miles of it, your brain starts making deals with itself, telling you the road is on autopilot now, telling you that nothing out here has changed, or could change, or ever would change, and that's exactly the kind of thinking that gets people into trouble at 2 in the morning, which is when this happened to me. I was hauling refrigerated freight from El Paso to San Antonio, a run I'd done more times than I could count. 9 hours of Texas darkness with the air conditioner fighting the outside heat even in October, and somewhere around the Van Horn exit, I noticed a set of headlights behind me that had been there for a while, not tailgating, not doing anything aggressive, just sitting back there at a respectful distance the way a patient driver does when they've accepted they're not going to pass a rig tonight. I clocked them for a few minutes and then forgot about them the way you do, because there's always somebody back there on a night run, and I had a podcast going and my coffee was still warm, and there was nothing wrong with the world at that particular moment. About an hour later, I happened to check my mirrors for a lane situation, and those same headlights were still there, same distance, same position, which is not completely strange on a road that offers exactly one choice of direction, but something about the consistency of it made me take a longer look. And that's when I noticed the headlights themselves were wrong, in a way I couldn't quite name at first. They were too far apart, wider than any standard vehicle, and the light was a different color than modern headlights, more of a dull yellow-white than the cool, bright white you see on anything built in the last 20 years, the kind of color you associate with older sealed beam units from a long time ago. I told myself it was an old truck, maybe an owner-operator running a beater with original equipment, nothing impossible about that, and I went back to my podcast. Another hour passed, and I pulled into a rest area outside Fort Stockton, not because I needed to, but because I was due for a log break, and because some part of me wanted to see what that vehicle looked like up close. I parked, cut my engine, got out, and walked back toward the entrance of the rest area to watch the highway. The headlights came up the road at the same steady pace they'd been holding all night, and I stood there waiting for them to pass, ready to see some weathered conventional or an old camper van or whatever it was going to turn out to be. They didn't pass. I don't mean they turned off or pulled in somewhere. I mean they were there, two yellow-white headlights moving at highway speed, and then they weren't. They simply ceased to exist somewhere between a quarter-mile away and the point where they would have drawn even with me, with nothing on the shoulder, and no exits, and no place for a vehicle to go that fast to disappear to in flat, empty Texas scrubland at 3 a.m. I stood at that rest area entrance for a long time after that, watching the highway, and nothing else came from that direction for 20 minutes, which on I-10 through West Texas is unusual enough, but not unheard of. What I keep coming back to is the consistency of it. 3 hours of those same lights at that same distance, patient as anything, like whatever was back there wasn't trying to catch up and wasn't trying to fall behind. It was just keeping pace, and the only reason I can think of for something to do, that is that it was waiting for something to happen that, for whatever reason, didn't happen that night, and I don't spend much time thinking about what that something might have been, because I have to run I-10 through West Texas every couple of months, and there's no version of that answer that makes the drive easier. The one I never wanted to talk about happened at a way station in Oklahoma that had been closed for years, and I want to say that up front because people hear way station and they assume I mean a functioning one. But this was a decommissioned facility on US 27. Oh, that had been closed since the early 2000s, gates locked, booth dark, the kind of place that shows up on satellite maps as a grey rectangle with weeds pushing through the concrete apron. I pulled in there around 4 a.m, not because I had any business being there, but because I'd heard a noise from my trailer that made me want to get off the road and walk around the rig before I drove another 100 miles with it. A metallic popping that could have been a strap, or could have been something worse. I eased through the open gate, which shouldn't have been open but was, and parked in the wide, empty apron in front of the dark booth, and I did my walk around with a flashlight, found nothing wrong that I could identify, and was about to get back in the cab when the booth light came on. Not the overhead fluorescence, just a small desk lamp inside the booth, the kind that sits on a surface and throws a cone of light downward. And in that cone of light, I could see a figure sitting at the desk with its back to the window, not moving, not reacting to my flashlight when I pointed it at the glass. I stood there for long enough that I should have been able to come up with a reasonable explanation. A security guard using an old lamp, a squatter who'd found a way in, anything that fit the shape of normal, and I couldn't. The building had no power connection that was still active. I knew that from the dead overhead lights, and the figure at the desk hadn't moved once in the 4 or 5 minutes I stood watching it. Not a shift of posture, not a turn of the head, nothing. I walked back to my truck deliberately, and not quickly, because I've learned over 20 years of driving that the way you walk back to your truck in a situation like that matters more than you'd think it does. It's the difference between being a person who encountered something strange and a person who ran from something strange, and I've always preferred to be the first kind. I got in, started up, pulled out onto the highway, and when I looked back in my mirror, the booth light was off. I've looked up that way station since, the actual history of it, and the only thing I've found that felt relevant was a 1-paragraph item in an old county paper about a DOT employee who'd had a medical emergency at that exact station back in 1998 and hadn't made it, died there before the ambulance arrived, and whose family had apparently requested that the station be named after him in some small way that never ended up happening, because the station closed a few years later, and the whole thing got forgotten by everyone except apparently whatever it is that keeps sitting at that desk in the dark. The last one I want to tell you happened not on a highway, but on the CB, which I know sounds small compared to the other things I've been telling you, but I've thought about it more than any of the others, and I think it's because of all the things that happened to me out on the road. This is the one where I understood most clearly that whatever I was dealing with was aware of me specifically, and not just present the way a haunted stretch of road is present for anyone who happens to drive it. I was running north on US 83 through Kansas, which is a road that goes through some of the most genuinely empty country in the middle of the country. Small towns that are mostly post offices and grain elevators, stretches between them long enough that the radio gives up entirely, and I had my CB on as background company the way I always do on lonely runs. Around 1 in the morning, someone came on the channel and started talking, not to anyone in particular, just talking, in the way older drivers sometimes do when they're tired and the night feels long, and I listened without keying up because the voice was calm and the stories were good, road stories, the kind that are really about time passing and distances covered. And after about 20 minutes of this, I keyed up and said something like, "Nice stories, old-timer. Keep them coming." There was a pause, and then the voice said, "I've been driving this road since before you were born, son." And I said something like, "I believe it." And we went quiet again. Another 10 minutes of driving, and the voice came back and said, "There's something on the road about 2 miles ahead of you, in the right lane. Slow down before you get there." I did slow down, not because I fully believed it, but because you don't ignore warnings on a dark highway. And about 1.5 miles later, my headlights picked up a deer, a big one, standing dead center in my lane, looking directly at my truck without any intention of moving. I got stopped in time, gave my horn a blast, and the deer eventually took itself off into the dark, and I keyed up and said, "Good call on that. You just saved me a real mess." There was no answer. I called a couple more times. Nothing, just the low hiss of the channel open and empty. About an hour later, I stopped for fuel in a small town, and mentioned it to the woman working the counter, because I was still thinking about it, and she got a particular expression on her face, not alarmed, more like recognition, and asked me what direction I'd been going on 83. And when I told her north, she nodded and said some of the older drivers who came through there talked about a voice on the CB on that stretch, a man who'd been running 83 for decades before he died, who'd always warned other drivers about hazards on the road, and who apparently hadn't entirely stopped doing it just because he was no longer technically driving. She said it like it was local knowledge, something everybody in that town already knew and had quietly made their peace with. And I drove the rest of the night thinking about a man who'd spent so many years watching out for other drivers that he couldn't stop doing it, even after the road was finished with him. And I think whatever you believe about what that was, that's a pretty decent way to spend eternity if you have to spend it somewhere.